In your Bible, when you get to the end of the Old Testament, you turn the page and you begin the New Testament. And so the Bible is set up where one directly leads to the other. And theologically, that's definitely the case, but historically, it's not the case. In between those pages is about 400 years of history. And if you've ever noticed, if you're familiar with both testaments, um, when you jump into the New Testament, you feel like you're almost in a different world, or maybe a different version of the world. Things are they feel different. It reads differently. In some ways, it's much easier and closer to home, and we're going to talk about why. But the why is wrapped up in those 400 years of history. So we call that time the intertestamental period, or we sometimes call it the silent years. We call it the silent years because the reason there's no biblical text in between, the reason why we have two distinct testaments, is because God stopped for about 400 years speaking to his people through the prophets after they returned from exile. I call it the silent years. Partly, I'll be honest, because it sounds cooler than intertestamental period, but some people would call it the intertestamental period. And so I want you to understand. We're not going to belabor this because if it was super duper duper important, all these details, it would be. I think it would be more included in the Bible. The Bible doesn't include this. But it's important for you and me to kind of understand. I want you to understand why, when you parachute into the New Testament, it seems so different. And so let's take a look. We're on page 34 in your handbook, and we want to see some of the things that are going on. Now, a little bit of what I talk about is going to reach into the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, specifically these empires. So this is a time of shifting empires. It's really confusing. And if you ever read like a history of the ancient Near East, which is that area, oh my gosh, it's like it is everybody's conquering everybody and stabbing everybody, and there's all these shifts, and it's very dynamic, and it's very confusing. What happens a lot of times with this history is that there'll be a place, and it's called whatever, thing A, but then Kingdom B comes in and takes over and renames that place. Or what sometimes happens is there'll be a group that's not a very big deal, and 100 years later they are a big deal. But you've been hearing about them for 100 years, and now all of a sudden they're a big deal, and just things move and shift, and it can be very hard to understand. So I decided to explain it to you in an overly basic way using fish. Right. So let me make sure you can see this here. So my little fish diagram goes like this. If you I want to make sure you can, I'm gonna put just the screen on to make sure you can see everything here. Okay. If you follow my fish, this is oversimplified. So this is not, a class on ancient Near Eastern history, but this is the simple version of what's going on. So we start with kind of the first major empire in the world, really, I would argue, is Assyria. There are other really strong civilizations before Assyria, but they're generally considered the first to be a proper empire where they're conquering territory and making it part of one giant whole, and they're spreading out around the world. Okay. So Assyria is the one that takes Israel captive. Assyria. We talked about that in the last video. After Assyria, Babylon becomes more prominent than Assyria, more of a big deal than Assyria. So as Assyria weakens, Babylon takes over the Assyrian Empire. Okay. Again, this is overly simplified. If you are like a historian and you're like, Andrew's a liar, he's not telling you all of the details. I'm not telling you all the details. Quite frankly, I don't really remember all the details. But this is, for our intents and purposes, I think enough. Okay. When Daniel is exiled, he's exiled under the Babylonian kings. And then it talks about all of a sudden, when you read Daniel, it talks about all of a sudden, it says in that very night, the Persians come in, the the Medes and the Persians is usually how Daniel calls it. The Medo-Persian Empire takes over. And we go, gosh, how do they take over in a day? I remember being a child and hearing that on a Bible on tape I had to go to bed by. And I was a weird kid, perhaps, but I was like, how does one empire take over another empire in a night? That seems kind of far-fetched. I was a skeptical lad. But really what was happening was they were already laying siege. They were already laying siege to the capital of Babylon. And while they're laying siege to that, the Babylonians are having this party that Daniel's at. That night is the night they broke through the siege and broke into the city. At that time, if you took the main city, you kind of got everything by a domino effect. Warfare was a little bit different that way. Nowadays, you have to take larger swaths of territory. It's not just about taking this city or that city exactly. That doesn't really matter. But I guess what I'm saying is, side note, the Bible, even in its historical recollections, is God-given truth. Okay, so Persia takes over. If you are reading Daniel, it begins with Babylonians, and it's going to end with Persians. And then if you read the book of Esther, Esther is also taking place in exile. Esther also takes place under the Persian Empire. As you read last time, Esther is in a place called Susa, which is sort of the forward operating capital of Persia. And so she's interacting with the Persians. And she actually is her story takes place after the first Jews got to go back home, but they didn't all go back home all at the same time. And so if you're like, where did we get to Persia with Esther? Basically, Persia conquered Babylon. So again, Babylon conquers Assyria, Persia conquers Babylon. And then what we don't get in the biblical account is the fact that Greece comes in and conquers Persia. So we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that in the Bible. The Old Testament closes kind of towards the end of the Persian Empire there, but Greece comes on the stage. If you've studied Daniel at all, Daniel has this vision of this statue, and Daniel explains that this statue, which as he goes down the statue from the head to the shoulders to the chest to the thighs to the feet, changes in what it's made of. And he's explaining that these are the kingdoms that are coming. And so he doesn't use the word Greece. He doesn't say, Greece is coming. But nevertheless, that's the next kingdom to come. And so what's really, 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 really important for you to know about that leading into the New Testament is that Greece brought Greek culture all over the Mediterranean world, really and beyond. They made it all the way to India. Alexander the Great was buried in Egypt. And so, this was a huge and fast-moving empire. But one of the lasting changes that it brought was that it brought Greek culture into Israel, and we're going to see in a little bit. That's why the New Testament feels very different from the Old Testament. After Alexander the Great died, his empire was broken up among his generals, and Israel passed kind of back and forth between the territories of two of those generals. So it's not that it moved, right, obviously, but who was in control moved back and forth a little bit. And then there was this brief period where the Jews were independent. We call it the Hasmonean dynasty. And so for a little bit, they were in charge of things, but then the biggest fish of all came in, which is Rome. And so the Roman Empire comes in. So by the time Jesus comes on the scene, it's the Romans that they're dealing with. So in a sense, they've come back and they're not in exile anymore, and they haven't been in a while. But in a different sense, when we look at these fish, for the most part, they've been under subjugation to somebody for, hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And so now it's Rome. And so that's important for you to know, especially that part about the Greek culture, which I'll get to here. Let me erase these arrows, and here we go. All right. There were several revolts. This is the top of page 35. There are several revolts that went on at the time. One of those is a pretty famous one where we get Hanukkah from, and so this king. Sometimes he's called a Persian ruler. Sometimes he's not. He's sort of. This is where it gets messy. Is who's who and who's what and who's descended from whom and who's on what team and who's is a little funky. But this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he erected a statue of Zeus in the Jewish temple and sacrificed a pig there. So this led to this big Jewish revolt where they were, he was trying to have everybody, pledge their loyalty, and it was the Maccabee family that refused and ended up leading this revolt and then needing to have the priests reconsecrate or repurify the temple from that pig sacrifice. And so that's where the festival of Hanukkah comes from, because they were they had to. So if you ever see Hanukkah menorah and you count, there's going to be 8 candle holders on there. They needed to go for 7 days. They didn't have enough oil to keep the candle burning for 7 days. So in the temple, the candlestick was 7, because the oil that they had miraculously lasted 8 days to perform the purification. A menorah for Hanukkah is 8 little oil candle wick holder things. That's the technical term, by the way. Anyway, that's where Hanukkah comes from. So we actually see Jesus celebrate Hanukkah. They call it the Winter Festival, or the Festival of Dedication. And so we do see Jesus celebrate that in the Gospels, but it's not called Hanukkah in the Gospels. Anyway, so if you've heard of that, that is from this time period. All right. One of the major things you need to understand, too, is the change in Judaism at this time. So some scholars will refer to what you and I think of as, the Jewish religion, or really the Old Testament, as ancient Israelite religion, as opposed to Judaism. And so if you were to meet a Jewish person today, they don't necessarily do the things and act the ways that are described in the Old Testament. And so where did that start to separate? It started to separate actually during the exile, but really in this period after the return, it still continued to really be solidified. What does that mean? First, okay, let me slow down here for a second. When the Jews are in exile, they're not near the temple. When they're not near the temple, they can't make sacrifices. When they can't make sacrifices, they start talking about sacrifices of praise, which is actually a phrase that they pulled out of Psalms. When they return, they rebuild the temple and they make sacrifices there again, but that temple would be destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. When it's destroyed, the Jews again, this is kind of oversimplified, but the Jews again return to that model of sacrifices of praise, prayer, and instead of gathering at a temple, they begin to gather at synagogues, which are more like a church gathering. It was 10 Jewish men or more would qualify as a synagogue. But here's where I steered you wrong. It's not, they didn't only form synagogues because the temple was destroyed in AD 70. They used synagogues before that. That model of the synagogue began during exile. What I'm saying is you have this split going on from what the Old Testament describes as the Jewish religion to what we now know as modern Judaism. And I'll explain. There's a few other things that are involved with that, but let me kind of follow your book a little bit better. There are 3 parties or sects of Judaism in Israel during the period when we see Jesus arrive on the scene, right? Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. The Bible describes Pharisees and Sadducees, but not Essenes. There's other groups, maybe more loosely structured, but other groups like the Zealots, which are political revolutionaries against Rome. So Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus's disciples, is one of these guys. Scribes is really more of an occupation though than a proper like sect or movement. They studied scripture. In order to copy the scripture accurately, they had to study it. So you'll see Jesus in the Gospels interact and answer questions from the scribes. Why questions from scribes? Well, they're not just Bob Cratchit, writing things out for Scrooge. These are scholars of the what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. There's lawyers, which are trying to apply those Hebrew Scriptures and the law into the everyday life of people. And so they're the ones kind of, oh, this is against or for, the law. And Jesus interacts with all those except the Essenes. The Essenes were separatists. They lived out in the desert. They most likely wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you've heard of that. There's some argument that they didn't write the Dead Sea Scrolls, but nevertheless, they lived out in the boonies, in the desert, and were waiting for the world to end, and really were separating themselves away from society. The Pharisees were a back to the Bible movement for the common man. So at Calvary Chapel, we would fit more of the paradigm of the Pharisees. Take that for what you will. But they were all over Israel. So if you notice in the Gospels, Jesus interacts with the Pharisees more than any other group because they were everywhere. Okay, and they were among the common people, and the common people often followed them. Not everybody, but many. Who's Jesus among? He's among the common people. And so the Pharisees are interacting with him a lot. They believed in they believed in the teaching of rabbis. Let me say two things about that. One, this started during the exile. So during the exile, there was a compilation of documents being put together that we call the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud, in basic terms, was there was a belief that for centuries, God had given Moses the actual write this down scriptures. And then alongside that, God also more privately or secretly gave this other tradition that that would be passed down through the priests. So the Pharisees believed that they were the sort of descendants of, this gets a little technical, but if you read Nehemiah chapters 8 and 9, there's this big kind of revival, and it says that the priests were explaining to people the sense of the text and translating its meaning to them. The Pharisees said, yeah, that's where we come from. We are descended from these guys who were there to explain the Bible to the common person. But the way that we do that or have that knowledge or have that kind of status is because we've been following this quiet, private, not written down oral tradition from all these rabbis. Part of the problem with that is you'd think the Bible would say something about that, and B, the rabbis didn't agree with each other, and the Bible agrees with itself. So I'm not putting credence on this, secret rabbinical line of teaching. I'm saying that this is where they felt that they had the authority to teach others. Okay. So that's the Pharisees. The Sadducees really controlled the temple. So you'll see Jesus interact with them less often. And the reason is he interacts with them when he's down in and near Jerusalem. That's where they hung out. The temple was sort of the quasi-official capital of the Jews. It was a place where they would, meet, and political things happened. And, they didn't have a capital per se. The Romans had taken over their capital. But the Pharisees controlled the temple. Therefore, the Pharisees really had the political clout and the relationships with sort of the worldly powers that were at the time. Okay. Where am I? Okay. Oh, as the Pharisees aligned themselves with common people, the Sadducees really aligned themselves with powerful people. They had... even it spells it out even in the book of Acts that they don't believe in angels and the resurrection. So they had a kind of a different set of ideas, different interpretation of Scripture, and maybe a looser interpretation. All right. The high priesthood. So if you read the Old Testament, you'll read about the high priesthood, which was supposed to be within this one family and its lineage. That by this point has become a political position, and it's bought and sold. There's multiple high priests at a time. So you'll read things in Jesus' trial like Caiaphas being high priest that year. Well, you weren't supposed to be high priest. Well, you served, yes, for a year, but what's going on too is there's this corruption where you have, it's now a position that's being bought and sold. It's a power broker kind of thing. It's not within the family of a guy named Phineas. You don't need to know that. So it's not what it was intended to be anymore. Okay. So I give you a little, on 35, I give you a little chart here to kind of just outline the differences between these three major religious sects of Judaism at the time. One thing that's interesting to notice is all three really thought of themselves as the true conservatives. Why? The Pharisees felt that they had this, again, this secret knowledge that went back to from the rabbis through the priests in Nehemiah, all the way back to Moses, okay? The Sadducees believed themselves to also be traced all the way back to Moses, but through the line of priests. And then the Essenes, they thought themselves as the true conservatives because they were so separate from the icky yucky world and its society, and that they were the true believers. They were kind of the extremists of the time. Okay. All right. Greek culture. I mentioned this is super important when you drop into the New Testament on page 36. So Alexander the Great spread Greek culture around the world. We call that process Hellenization. Hellenization. Why? Because the Greek word for Greece is Hellenica. Hellenica. From Hellenica, we get Hellenization. And so really, that's why the New Testament is written in Greek. It's written by Jewish people, but Greek now is the literary language of the day. So they're not writing it in Hebrew like the Old Testament, they're writing it in Greek. And we're going to talk about language in a second here. But this is really, really important for why, I want you to hear this, why the New Testament feels and reads so differently. And it's a part of why you're probably more comfortable reading it. So if you've read both the Old and New Testaments, there are theological reasons that the New Testament is easier to read because, quite frankly, it's closer to home. It's written in what we're going to call in the next lesson the church age. So it's written within our time in biblical history and the Bible story. So there's a theological reason it's easier to read, but there's a cultural reason. You and I, if you're raised in the West, if you're raised in America or Europe, which the vast majority of you will have been, you were raised with a Greek version of education and of philosophy and of thinking. Even if you never knew that, you really were. The underpinnings of Western culture come from Greek ideas and Greek philosophies. And so the New Testament, let me be very careful here as well. The New Testament is written within that world, within that mentality, and often in those literary structures. That doesn't mean the New Testament is written completely with a Greek mindset. It actually comes against a Greek mindset in certain ways. How is not important for right now. But what I'm saying is the way that it talks is a much more Greek way of talking than the Old Testament. Now, if you, if you take one of our missions classes that we've done or will be coming up, you'll learn that in a lot of cultures, the Old Testament is actually way more easy and way more familiar. Because of the culture in some countries around the world, the familial structures, the honor structures, the economic structures, a lot of the things that are built into the Old Testament and its culture make a lot more sense to people in other cultures from our own. So what I'm saying is this: the Old Testament can feel so weird and foreign, and why are there so many camels, and what the heck is going on here? But part of that is cultural. So it's not that it's theologically. I did say the New Testament is theologically closer to our time in history. Yes, it is, and this class will help explain that. But you have to understand that there's a very simple cultural reason why the New Testament reads differently to you. When you read one of Paul's letters and the arguments that he lays out, the way he lays out an argument is a much more Greek and therefore much easier to read kind of a way to follow those logic kind of things. So understand that. You can read about that here a little bit on 36. The other thing I want you to understand that's different is language in this era, is a shift in language. So as I said, Greek was the language of learning. So at different times throughout history, there's been sort of the academic language in the world. There was a time where it was Latin, and there's actually a part of the city of Paris called the Latin Quarter. It's called the Latin Quarter because that's where the Sorbonne was, or is still actually, this medieval university. At the time, to go to university, you learned Latin, and all of your scholarship in university was done in Latin in the Middle Ages. And so you could go all over Europe and people would exchange and go to different countries and study because it was all done in Latin. That's why in Paris, that part where all the students lived was called the Latin Quarter. Useless, but it's by way of saying throughout history there's been shared academic languages that may not be the language people speak in their homes. Okay, it's the language of public academic thought. At the time the New Testament was written, that language was Greek. Is that the language of the whole empire? No, they're Roman. They're speaking Latin, but it's Greek is the language you wrote in, and so the New Testament is written in Greek. Again, Latin is the language of the Romans and of Roman law. People in Israel spoke Aramaic. So Aramaic is kind of a Hebrew and Syrian dialect. It's interesting. It's really old, but was only used by a smaller group of people in the past. At this point, it's much more widely used there in the first century. If you go watch the Passion of the Christ uses these languages. So not Greek, because again, they're writing in Greek. They're not speaking Greek on a daily basis. So in the Passion of the Christ, you'll hear the Romans speaking Latin, and then Jesus and the Jews are speaking Aramaic. And they actually had an Aramaic scholar who helped with the making of that movie. And so that might give you a picture there if you wanna check out that movie. And then some Jews would have learned Hebrew, mostly for studying religion. But Hebrew, as we know it, was not the everyday language there of the people. So what languages are on the cross when Jesus is nailed to the cross? When it says above him, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, it's in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, and this is why. Another thing you need to understand as you jump into the New Testament is the change in scope and pacing. So, Old Testament covers thousands of years, okay? Covering thousands of years, it's going to do two things. One, it's going to be selective. So where we read and we're like, oh, God appeared to so-and-so, and you're like, that seems to happen all the time in the Old Testament. That just seems like a normal Wednesday for this person. No. Sometimes God appears to so-and-so, and then in the next chapter or two, God appears to so-and-so again, and when you really start to look at the details, it's like 30 years later. I'm kind of pulling example. I'm not giving you hard examples, but often with Abraham or with David, Joseph, their stories are taking place over decades, but because we can read them fairly quickly, they feel like they move fairly quickly. What's really happening is the Old Testament's being very selective. It's covering thousands of years, so it's going to be selective in what it covers. So it's going to give you the highlights, the Sports Center, play of the week kind of a thing. And if you watch just the play of the week every week, you would think all of that sport was really, really, really more interesting than it probably is. So in the Old Testament, you're seeing these sort of the selected highlights, if you will. The second thing is because it has to cover so much, it's going to leave large gaps of time in between. So again, in the Old Testament, what takes pages might be decades, right? The New Testament is like the exact opposite. The entire New Testament really takes place in no more than 90 years. which is nothing in comparison to the Old Testament. And the vast majority of the New Testament takes place between AD 30 and about AD 65. Okay, so really, we're not talking about huge swaths of time. The Gospels give a little picture of Jesus' birth, a quick check in when he's 12, and then pretty much the rest of the Gospels take place in 3 years. The Gospel of John, the vast majority of the text of the Gospel of John takes place in 1 week, the last week of Jesus' life, and even within that, a number of chapters are simply one night that we would call the Last Supper. So the pacing is very different. When Jesus is arrested in the Gospels, and he's bouncing around from place to place, he's going within a square mile in a single night. He's just bouncing between, it'd be like if I said, okay, you're going to go from our church to Target, from Target to, the Jack in the Box down on Madison, and then back to the church, and then back to Target. You can do all that in one night. And so a lot of times it's a much faster, more sped up kind of thing. Another example, there's a story where Jesus is on his way from place A to place B. Someone stops him and talks with him. While they're talking with him, somebody interrupts him. He turns, deals with this, back to this person, and then on his way. We get all of this going on, but it's going on in like 10 minutes time, right? You can kind of tell just how fast the dialogue is moving. So understand that when you read the Old and New Testaments. It's one of the key differences. And then real quick, just more of a factual kind of note. When we talk about the temple, sometimes we talk about 3 temples or a second temple period, a third temple period, Solomon's temple, Herod's temple, Ezra's temple. That can be a little confusing. I think we can just iron that out really quickly. Solomon built a temple, and there's a small little kind of model of it there on the left, which in its day was fascinating and amazing and took them a very long time to build. That was destroyed by the Babylonians when the Babylonians took over Judah. Jerusalem is within Judah. So the Babylonians looted that and destroyed it. It was rebuilt when the Jews came back. It was rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Ezra when the Jews came back into the land. It was the temple we talked about last time was disappointing, was never what it was originally. It never met its original glory under Solomon. So you read in Ezra how the people are disappointed with the temple. That temple stuck around, and we sometimes call it the Second Temple period. You don't really need to know that. This guy Herod came along, and Herod really expanded it into the biggest version it ever was. That was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. And so that's going to be important for you to know. All right, so that's why the Old Testament and the New Testament feel differently. That's why when you parachute into the New Testament, all of a sudden you feel like you're maybe in a different world, different tone, different things going on. A lot of that is understanding what's happened in between the Testaments. There's a lot there. I gave you the way oversimplified version. If you want some resources, you want to learn more about that, by all means, I can recommend a few to you. But if this is enough for you, then you can move on to the next thing.